She would enter a room, and men would literally stop breathing. One French minister fainted upon seeing her at a reception at the Soviet embassy. The Italian director Fellini spent 3 hours begging her to be in his film, kneeling right in the middle of a Roman restaurant. A Moscow artist painted 17 portraits of her, after which he destroyed them all, because not one captured even a tenth of her magnetism. But the most terrible thing happened later. This woman, capable of stopping a crowd with her gaze, died in absolute solitude. Neighbors only found her 3 days later. There was a note on the table, but what was written in it was classified by investigators for 50 years. Today we will tell a story that will take your breath away. Vologda, 1952. 17-year-old Regina Kolesnikova came to Moscow for the first time to apply to an institute. A girl from the provinces, the daughter of a simple military man. She did not stand out in any way among the hundreds of other applicants, except for one thing. As she walked past the admissions committee of the Plekhanov Moscow Institute of National Economy, the chairman of the committee, the elderly Professor Gromov, suddenly stopped mid-sentence and followed her with his gaze to the very end of the corridor. Then he quietly said to his assistant, "Remember this girl. She will either become great or she will perish. There is no third option." A strange prophecy, isn't it? But what happened next was even stranger. In the personal file of Regina Kolesnikova, which was stored in the Institute's archive, a special mark appeared. A small red dot in the corner of the folder. Such marks were only placed on the documents of students of special interest to certain agencies. And this was 4 years before she first stepped onto the podium. Why did an ordinary student of the economics faculty attract the attention of those who preferred to stay in the shadows? The answer came many years later, when some documents were declassified. It turns out that the KGB had a special department engaged in cultural diplomacy, and this department had a project codenamed Showcase. The essence of the project was to create the ideal image of a Soviet woman for the Western world. A beautiful, educated, inaccessible woman who was supposed to prove the superiority of the socialist system without a single word about politics. The first contact occurred in her 3rd year at the institute. A young French language teacher, Oleg Borisovich Krylov, approached Regina. That's how he introduced himself. He offered additional lessons for free. "You have exceptional language abilities," he explained. Regina agreed. Only 30 years later did it turn out that no Oleg Borisovich Krylov had ever been on the institute's staff. In reality, he was KGB Major Viktor Semenov, a graduate of an intelligence school, a specialist in working with a special contingent. His task was to prepare Regina for a role she herself did not yet suspect. The French lessons quickly turned into classes on etiquette, art history, and the basics of diplomatic protocol. "Why do I need all this?" Regina asked. "An educated woman must know everything," her mentor replied. In parallel with this, other strange things were happening. Regina was suddenly offered to move from the dormitory to a separate room in a communal apartment on Arbat Street. A spot opened up, the dean's office explained. Her neighbors turned out to be quiet, polite people who never asked unnecessary questions. Only many years later did she learn that they were all employees or agents of the KGB. And then that fateful meeting occurred, 1955. Gum department store. Regina was trying on a coat when an elegant woman approached her. "Young lady, have you ever thought about working as a fashion model?" It was Vera Orlova, the legendary designer from the fashion house on Kuznetsky Most. The meeting seemed accidental, but was it really? A curious document has been preserved in the KGB archives. A memorandum dated March 12, 1955. Object successfully brought to the target point. Orlova has carried out instructions, awaiting further development of the operation. The signature is illegible, but the seal is authentic. Regina came to the fashion house. She was accepted immediately, without a casting, which was unheard of. Her colleagues whispered, "Connections." But what connections could a girl from Vologda have? The answer was simple and terrible at the same time. Her roof was those who could open any doors and shut any mouths. Her training at the fashion house ran parallel to another training. In the evenings, a black Volga would pick Regina up and take her to a dacha in Serebriany Bor. There, she was taught to memorize faces and names, to notice details, to maintain the right conversations. "You will represent our country," they told her. Your beauty is a weapon in the fight for minds and hearts. Paris, 1961. Le Bourget Airport. A Soviet delegation of fashion models exits the plane. In the lead is Regina Zbarskaya. Yes, Zbarskaya now. She had married the artist Lev Zbarsky, and this surname opened even more doors. But right now, something else was important. 3 days before the flight, Regina was summoned to Lubyanka. Not with an official summons, they simply called her home and said, "You are expected." She knew she couldn't refuse. In an office with high ceilings and heavy curtains, she was met by Colonel Mikhailov. Gray-haired, with piercing blue eyes, he spoke quietly, almost in a whisper, which made his words sound even more frightening. "Regina Nikolaevna," he began, lighting a paparosa cigarette. "You are not just going to model dresses. You are going to show the West the face of the new Soviet woman. Beautiful, free, happy." He paused, exhaled smoke. "But freedom is a relative concept, isn't it?" A folder of photographs appeared on the table. Regina turned cold. The pictures were of her younger sister Tamara, who lived in Vologda with their sick mother. The photos were recent, from yesterday. "Don't worry," the colonel smiled. "Your family is fine, and will remain fine if you are sensible." The briefing lasted 4 hours. Regina was explained whom she could associate with and with whom she absolutely could not. They gave her photos of people she was supposed to accidentally meet at receptions. They taught her how to discreetly overhear conversations and memorize details. "You are not a spy," the colonel emphasized. "You are just an attentive Soviet citizen." In Paris, a translator, Galina Mikhailovna, was assigned to the delegation, a plump, good-natured woman of about 50. She seemed like a harmless auntie, but Regina noticed, Galina Mikhailovna never slept. Even at night, walking past her room, one could see a strip of light under the door. And she also had a phenomenal memory. She remembered every word spoken by any member of the delegation during the day. The show at Pierre Cardin's was a triumph. When Regina walked onto the podium in a white evening gown, the hall froze in absolute silence for several seconds and then exploded with applause. After the show, Cardin himself approached her. "Mademoiselle, you are the embodiment of the Russian enigma," he said in French. Regina replied with a memorized phrase about the friendship of peoples, but Cardin did not back down. He invited her to dinner. "Go," Galina Mikhailovna said unexpectedly, and added quietly, "but remember the limits of what is permissible." What did she mean? Regina understood later, when the cultural attaché of the Soviet embassy coincidentally sat down at their table in the restaurant. Regina's life turned into a performance where she played herself, but according to someone else's script. Every trip abroad was accompanied by new assignments. They became more and more sophisticated. Rome, 1963. At a reception honoring the opening of an exhibition of Soviet art, Italian industrialist Giovanni Rossellini approached Regina. Rich, influential, crazy about Russian women. The curator from the embassy nudged Regina. "Be nice to him." What nice meant required no explanation. Rossellini fell in love, gave her jewelry, which Regina was obliged to hand over to the embassy. He wrote letters, which were read before she saw them. He invited her to a villa in Tuscany, where she went accompanied by her friend, KGB Captain Nina Volkova, who was fluent in Italian and could read lips. But the worst part began when Regina truly fell in love. Not with Rossellini, but with the French photographer Jean-Louis Dubois. He was photographing her for Vogue, and between them arose what KGB reports delicately called non-target emotional contact. Dubois was married but was ready to leave everything for Regina. He offered her to stay in France, promised a divorce, a new life, freedom. Regina remained silent. She knew that their every meeting was being watched. There were microphones in her hotel room. She found one by accident when she dropped her powder compact behind the bed. From then on, she would turn on the water in the bathroom when she wanted to cry, so they wouldn't hear. One night, there was a knock on the door of her Paris room. On the threshold stood a man she had never seen before, but she immediately understood who he was. "Regina Nikolaevna," he said in Russian with a slight Georgian accent. "You are playing a dangerous game. Monsieur Dubois is not who he claims to be." The stranger placed photographs on the table. Dubois in the company of people Regina recognized. They were French communists she had met at receptions. He works for French counterintelligence, the visitor continued. They are using you to get to our people. Do you understand what that means? Whether it was true or a lie, Regina never found out. But she had no choice. The next day, she told Dubois that it was over between them. He didn't believe it, begged her to explain. She was silent. A week later, the delegation returned to Moscow. And a month later, Regina learned from French newspapers. Jean-Louis Dubois had crashed his car on a mountain road in the Alps. An accident, the journalists wrote. Regina knew. In their world, there were no accidents. In her Moscow apartment, her husband, Lev Zbarsky, was waiting for her. A talented artist, the son of a famous academician. He lived in his own world of bohemia and art. Did he know about his wife's double life? He suspected, but said nothing. He had his own secrets, his own meetings that were not to be spoken of aloud. Their marriage became a screen, behind which each hid their own pain. Imagine for a second. You wake up in your Moscow apartment on Kutuzovsky Prospect. A chic apartment, by the way. 3 rooms, high ceilings, a view of the Moskva River. For a Soviet person of the 60s, an unattainable dream. You go to the window, pull back the heavy curtain, and see a black Volga in the courtyard. It's there every morning. Sometimes it moves, now by the first entrance, now by the third, but it's always there. You go to the kitchen to make coffee. Rare, scarce, brought from your last trip to Italy. You turn on the radio and immediately turn it off, because you know they listen not only to what you say, but also to what you listen to. Paranoia. Oh, if only. Regina Zbarskaya lived exactly like that. Every day, every damn day of her brilliant, successful, absolutely unbearable life. Here is a document that was found in the declassified archives. It is dated October 1964. Object Swan, as they called her, is showing signs of emotional instability. Attempts to violate the observation regime have become more frequent. It is recommended to strengthen control. The signature, Major Semenov. The same one who once taught her French. And what was behind this violation of the regime? Regina did the unthinkable. She tried to call her mother in Vologda from a public payphone. Not from her home phone, which was bugged, but from an ordinary booth near the metro. 30 kopecks. The ringing, her mother's voice. "Sweetheart, how are you?" And then the connection cuts off. Not by itself. It was interrupted. An hour later, the phone rang in her apartment. "Regina Nikolaevna, you are expected at the studio for a fitting." There was no fitting, of course. There was a conversation in the back room of the fashion house. Colonel Mikhailov. Yes, he was a colonel by then. He spoke quietly, almost affectionately. "Why these foolish games? You want to talk to your mother? Please. We will organize her visit to Moscow. A nice hotel, with excursions. Do you understand the horror? They didn't threaten directly. They cared. They surrounded her with such a dense cocoon of attention that it became impossible to breathe. A personal doctor from the KGB, a hairdresser, an informant. Even the masseuse at the fashion house regularly wrote reports on the object's mood. And here the story takes a completely unexpected turn. Summer, 1965. Regina is on tour in London. After the show, an elderly gentleman approaches her. He introduces himself as Michael Collins, a journalist for the Sunday Times. He speaks Russian with a slight accent. "I know who you are, and I know you want out of this game." Regina looks around. The translator is distracted, talking to the organizers. "I have an offer," Collins says quickly. "Political asylum, new documents, protection from British intelligence. Decide quickly. You fly out tomorrow." She said no. Why? Let's delve into the psychology of a person cornered. Regina still had her husband in Moscow. Even if their marriage was a sham, Lev was the only person who accepted her as she was. In Vologda, her mother and sister. What would they do to them if she defected? But most importantly, listen carefully to this. She still believed she could outplay the system. That her beauty, fame, and connections would help her escape the web. Naivety. Or a last attempt to preserve her dignity. Collins disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared, and 2 days later, back in Moscow, Regina was summoned to Staraya Square. Not to Lubyanka, but higher. To the Central Committee of the party. A man she had never seen before, but whose name everyone knew, was waiting for her. Mikhail Suslov, the party's chief ideologue, the Grey Cardinal of Soviet power. "Comrade Zbarskaya," he began, without even offering her a seat. "You were made a certain offer in London." It wasn't a question. Regina was silent. "You did the right thing." He paused, took off his glasses, wiped them. "But trust has been undermined. Rehabilitation is necessary." What he meant by rehabilitation became clear a week later. A new curator was assigned to Regina. If Colonel Mikhailov was a tough professional of the old school, Major Voronov? Oh, he was a completely different type. Young, barely over 30, handsome, with that specific kind of handsomeness cultivated in elite KGB units, and absolutely pathologically cruel. Voronov began by making a jealous scene for Regina. Yes, exactly, jealous. In public, at a reception at the House of Journalists. He walked up while she was talking to a French correspondent and said in Russian, loud enough for others to hear, "At it again with your flings?" Everyone turned around. Regina tried to leave. He grabbed her arm, not painfully, but firmly. "We'll talk later," he promised. The talk took place that same night. Voronov came to her home. He simply opened the door with his own key, how did he get one, and walked in. Lev was in his studio, working on another portrait. Voronov went into the living room, poured himself a cognac from the crystal decanter, and sat in an armchair. "Do you know what your problem is, Regina Nikolaevna? You think you're a star, but you're an instrument. A beautiful, useful instrument. And when an instrument starts to dull..." He didn't finish the sentence. He just smiled. And then began what KGB documents would call an operation for psychological correction. Voronov systematically destroyed Regina's life. First, the invitations to international shows disappeared. Failed the security clearance. Then, problems started for Lev. Suddenly, no one would buy his paintings. Exhibitions were cancelled. Her sister, Tamara, in Vologda, lost her job as a teacher. Ideological non-compliance. Regina understood. This was revenge for London, for Collins, for the very thought of freedom. But the most terrible thing was yet to come. One evening, her friend, the model Lena Mityolkina, came over. She brought a bottle of Hungarian wine, sat down in the kitchen, and suddenly burst into tears. "Regina, they're forcing me to spy on you. To write reports. What you say, who you meet, what you're thinking." Lena put a stack of papers on the table. Copies of her reports. "Forgive me. Forgive me." That night, Regina took her first dose of sleeping pills. Not to sleep forever. Just to not think. Not feel. To be no one for at least a few hours. Not a beauty. Not a spy. Not an instrument. No one. Moscow, 1967. A meeting is underway in the office of the head of the 5th Directorate of the KGB. On the table is a folder with photos of Regina Zbarskaya. But these are not the glossy shots from podiums that Western magazines printed. These are photos of a different kind. Regina leaving a pharmacy with prescription drugs. Regina hugging a bottle of Armenian cognac in her own apartment. Regina with eyes red from crying after another fight with her husband. Major General Philippe Bobkov personally supervised this operation. In his view, Zbarskaya had become too unpredictable. The Western press called her a Soviet-style icon. But for the KGB, she had turned into a ticking time bomb. She knew too much, knew too many people, and, most importantly, was losing control of herself. The decision was made at the very top. Not to eliminate her, she was too prominent a figure, but to discredit her, to bring her down, to make the West lose interest in her. The operation received a cynical name: Fallen Star. The first blow was delivered through the fashion house. The new artistic director, Tatiana Gordieva, appointed with direct support from the KGB, began a systematic campaign of harassment. Regina was removed from the main shows under the pretext of non-compliance with new standards. What standards? No one explained. Simply, One morning, her photos disappeared from the best models of the fashion house display. The young model Galia Milovskaya later recalled, "It was terrifying to watch. Regina would come to work and they would tell her, 'You are not participating today.' She would sit in the dressing room and just stare into the mirror for hours. We were afraid to talk to her. We knew that any word of support would be interpreted as disloyalty to the management." But the vilest thing happened in March 1968. Regina received a call from the office of the Minister of Culture, Yekaterina Furtseva, the same Furtseva who had once patronized her, calling her our secret weapon of beauty. Regina went to the meeting full of hope. Maybe Yekaterina Alexeyevna would help. Furtseva greeted her coldly. On the table lay photographs, the same compromising ones. Regina with foreign diplomats. Regina in a restaurant with suspicious individuals. Regina. Many of the photos were fakes, but did that matter? "You are disgracing Soviet culture with your behavior," Furtseva said, not looking her in the eye. "As of today, you are suspended from all international shows, and I advise you to get a grip on yourself, before it's too late." Regina left the office and understood. This was the end. Not of her career, but of the life she had known. That evening, she drank an entire bottle of valerian drops, washing it down with cognac. Lev found her unconscious in the bathroom. Ambulance, hospital, IV drips. The official story: food poisoning. And now, let's listen to those who saw it all with their own eyes, but remained silent for decades. In 2010, shortly before her death, the model Mila Romanovskaya gave an interview that was never published in full. Here are fragments from that recording. "We all knew what was happening to Regina. Everyone. But what could we do? To stand up for her meant signing your own sentence. I had 2 children. Others had families, parents. We were hostages. Beautiful, successful hostages. I remember a show at GUM, 1969. Regina was supposed to model the evening collection. She was always the queen of evening gowns. An hour before the show, Gordieva came in and said, 'Zbarskaya is not going out today. She's drunk.' It was a lie. I saw Regina in the dressing room. She was completely sober. Only her hands were shaking from nerves, but the most terrible thing, you know what the most terrible thing was? How quickly everyone turned away from her. Yesterday's friends would cross to the other side of the street. Admirers disappeared. Even the photographers who had shot only her for years suddenly found new muses. It wasn't a natural process. It was planned isolation. Another testimony was left by the photographer Lev Sherstenikov, who worked for the magazine Soviet Woman. An order came from above. "Do not photograph Zbarskaya." Just like that, without explanation. I had a layout ready with her for the cover. Magnificent shots in Kolomenskoye. The editor took the folder with the photos and right in front of me threw it in the trash bin. "Forget this name," he said. I tried to save at least the negatives. I hid them at home, on the mezzanine. A week later, comrades came to my place for an inspection. How did they find out? The negatives were confiscated. I was warned. I never worked with Regina again. No one did. The testimony of Eleonora Shashkova, a costumer at the fashion house, is especially valuable. Regina was systematically driven to a breakdown. They would accidentally ruin her dress before a show. They would forget to inform her about schedule changes. They slipped something into her coffee. After drinking it, she would become lethargic, sluggish. Who slipped it? I don't know. But it happened regularly. One day I tried to warn her. I whispered, "Regina, don't drink anything from the buffet." The next day, Voronov summoned me. Yes, that same major. "Eleonora Pavlovna," he said affectionately, "you have a grandson studying in Leningrad, a good university, prestigious. It would be a shame if he suddenly failed his exams." I understood the hint. But the most shocking testimony was left by Valentina Yashina, the psychiatrist who consulted Regina in her final years. She was being purposefully driven insane. It was sophisticated psychological terror. Gaslighting, as they would call it now. They would plant things in her apartment and convince her she had bought them herself and forgotten. They would move furniture and tell her she was imagining it. They would call her at night and stay silent on the line. Regina would come to me and cry, "Doctor, I'm going crazy. I'm really losing my mind." What could I tell her? That the KGB was persecuting her. She already knew that. But knowing didn't save her from the destruction of her psyche. 2009. A basement room at Lubyanka. The historian archivist Andrei Petrovich Sokolov gains access to a file marked, "Store forever, not subject to declassification." But times had changed, and some documents nonetheless fell into his hands. What he discovered made him, a man who had seen all sorts of things in the KGB archives, step out to smoke several times just to compose himself. The Swan file. The operational development file on Regina Zbarskaya contained over 3,000 pages. Daily surveillance reports, transcripts of wiretapped phone conversations, protocols of personal correspondence being opened. But the most horrifying part was hidden in the special measures section. Here is an excerpt from a report by Major Voronov dated April 15, 1970. The object is demonstrating increased resistance to psychological influence. A transition to Phase B is recommended, using pharmacological correction of behavior. The preparation Bluebird has shown effectiveness in similar cases. Dosage according to instruction number 47S. What was preparation Bluebird? In another document, we find the explanation. An experimental development of the KGB Institute of Pharmacology, a psychotropic substance that causes depressive states, paranoia, and suicidal thoughts with prolonged use in small doses. How was it given to Regina? The answer is in the next document. Through Agent Margot, who worked as a buffet attendant at the fashion house. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. The file contains a section titled Compromising Materials. Photographs intended to destroy Regina's reputation in the event of her attempting to defect to the West. Many of them are blatant fakes. Photomontages, executed at a surprisingly high level for that time. In one, Regina is supposedly in bed with a Western diplomat. In another, at a party with dissidents. All lies, but crafted so skillfully that it was impossible to tell them from the truth. Another document, protocol of a meeting from January 3, 1971. Major General Babkov, Colonel Mikhailov, Major Voronov, and someone designated as a representative of the Central Committee are present. The issue of the final resolution of the Barskaya problem is being discussed. Voronov suggests driving the subject to a suicide attempt, then placing her in a psychiatric clinic. Mikhailov objects, too much resonance, the West might become interested. The Central Committee representative suggests a compromise. Gradual social death. Deprive her of work, housing, drive her to complete isolation. Let her drink herself to death or take her own life. Cleanly, quietly, without our direct involvement. The file also contains transcripts from the surveillance of Regina's final years. Here is a recording from February 14, 1985. Regina, alone in the apartment, talks to herself, a sign of progressive psychiatric disorder. "They are here. I know you can hear me. Why don't you just kill me? Why these games? I am already dead. I have been dead for 10 years. Of particular interest is the correspondence between the Moscow KGB and the residencies in Paris, Rome, and London. Western journalists periodically inquired about the fate of the Red Queen of the catwalk. The answer was standard. Zbarskaya has retired from active life due to health reasons, resides in Moscow, and leads a private life. Not a word of truth. Moscow, November 15, 1987, 9:47 a.m. A call comes into the militia department on Begovaya. A female voice, breaking with agitation. "Come quickly. I think she's dead. Room 47, communal apartment on Begovaya, building 13. Duty Sergeant Petrov logs the call, but something in the caller's voice makes him wary. He would later recall, she wasn't crying. It was as if she was waiting for this call. The first to arrive on the scene is a patrol unit. Junior Lieutenant Igor Savalyev, 23 years old, only 1 month out of the academy. What he saw in room number 47 made him run out into the corridor and take a long time to compose himself. 30 years later, already a retired colonel, he would speak about that day. "You see, I've seen different deaths. But this..." She was lying on the bed like Sleeping Beauty from a fairy tale. A burgundy evening gown with sequins, high-heeled shoes. Can you imagine? She put on shoes to die. Her face was perfectly made up, every eyelash in place. And the smell. The whole room smelled of expensive perfume, but underneath it, there was another smell. Bitter almonds. I didn't know what it meant then, but the senior operative understood immediately. Cyanide. But here's the strange part. At the official autopsy, no cyanide was found. Only sleeping pills in a lethal dose. How that happened, I don't know. The documents were rewritten 3 times. I saw the initial protocol. It said something completely different. Investigator Anatoly Kremlin, who handled the case, remained silent for 20 years. But in 2007, dying of cancer, he summoned a journalist and dictated what was not included in the official documents. When I arrived at the scene, other people were already there, not militia. 2 men in civilian clothes introduced themselves as employees of the Ministry of Culture. What Ministry of Culture at a death scene? But they had documents that I had no right to check. They were looking for something in the room, turned everything upside down, but neatly, professionally. They took some folder with papers and a small notebook. A neighbor, Antonina Petrovna Kuznetsova, tried to tell me something. She said that the evening before, a man had visited Regina. Tall, in a black coat, with a cane. A strange detail. A cane. Who walked with a cane in '87? But when the men from the ministry heard about the visitor, they took the neighbor into another room. Half an hour later, she came out pale and didn't remember anything anymore. Nothing at all. And the note? God, that note. Beauty must die beautifully. Forgive me, I am tired of playing this role. But it wasn't her handwriting. I compared it with documents I found in the room. Receipts, old letters, similar, but not identical. Someone had tried very hard to imitate her handwriting, but it wasn't a perfect forgery. I wrote about this in the report. The report was returned with a resolution. Rewrite, exclude speculation. I rewrote it. But the most mysterious part began when a man claiming to be Regina's brother got involved. The problem is, she didn't have any brothers. Only a sister, Tamara. The man, calling himself Nikolai Kolesnikov, appeared on the 3rd day after her death, presented documents that looked authentic, and demanded the body be released for burial in Vologda, her homeland. This is where the real detective story begins. The neighbor from the communal apartment, that same Antonina Petrovna Kuznetsova, suddenly remembered a detail a week later. The man with the cane who visited Regina on her last evening spoke with a slight accent. Not foreign, but regional, as if from the Baltics. He also had a scar on his left hand between his thumb and forefinger. A very distinctive scar in the shape of a half-moon. Investigator Kremlin, intrigued by these details, began his own investigation. What he discovered went beyond a normal criminal case. In the MVD archives, he found a mention of a man with a similar description. Oleg Karlovich Rosenberg, a former Soviet intelligence officer, a specialist in wet affairs assassinations, officially died in 1983 in a car crash. But the body was identified by documents. The face was mutilated beyond recognition. Kremlin kept digging and found a connection between Rosenberg and Regina Zbarskaya. It turns out, in 1962, they crossed paths in Paris. Rosenberg was working under cultural cover. Regina was there for shows. According to unconfirmed reports, they had an affair, short but passionate. It ended abruptly. Rosenberg was recalled to Moscow, and they never met again. Or did they? In Regina's apartment, after the body had been removed, a strange thing was found. Under a floorboard lay a small bundle, an old photograph, and a note. In the photo, Regina and a man whose face had been neatly cut out. On the back, a date. Paris, May 1962. The note contained only one phrase. I will come back for you. Wait, oh. The investigation unexpectedly continued in 1993. A woman came to see the journalist Vladimir Melnikov, who was writing a book about Soviet models. She introduced herself as Marina, withholding her last name. She said she had worked as a nurse in a closed KGB clinic in the '80s. I can't be silent anymore, she began, nervously twisting a handkerchief. What they did to Regina Zbarskaya. It was monstrous. They brought her to us regularly, starting in '72. officially for treatment of nervous exhaustion. In reality, Marina paused, gathering her strength. What she said next was hard to comprehend. There was a secret program, Marionette. Psychopharmacological control over people of operational interest. Regina was one of the test subjects. They injected her with experimental drugs that destroyed willpower, made her suggestible, controllable. But she turned out to be too strong. Her psyche resisted. I remember one incident. It was in '75. Regina was brought in after another breakdown. The head doctor, Colonel Arkhipov of the medical service, personally conducted the session. They used a combination of drugs and hypnosis, trying to convince her that her whole life in the West was a hallucination, a morbid fantasy, that she had never been a famous model, that she had dreamt it all. Do you know what she said when she came out of the hypnosis? "Doctor, even if it is a dream, it is more beautiful than your reality." Arkhipov was furious. He ordered the dosage increased. I tried to object. It could kill her. He looked at me and said, "Sometimes, death is a mercy." But Regina survived. Moreover, she began to pretend the treatment was working. She played the role of a broken, submissive woman. But at night, when she thought no one was watching, she wrote tiny letters on toilet paper. She hid the notes in the most unbelievable places. I found them by chance when cleaning her room. One of the notes said, "They think they have broken me. Let them think it. I am waiting." He promised to return, and I believe. Even if I have to wait in hell, I will wait. Who was she waiting for? I didn't know then. Now, I think. The man with the cut-out face in the photograph. Marina took a yellowed sheet of paper from her bag. One of those very notes. If you are reading this, it means I am already gone. Or, the me that you knew is gone. They have erased my past, my present. They are trying to erase my future. But they cannot erase the main thing. Love. It is stronger than their drugs, their hypnosis, their system. O knows the truth. O will come. Until then, I am playing my final role, the insane former beauty. They won't give me an Oscar for it, but I know it is my best role, because it will save the one I love. Melnikov tried to find this mysterious O, but all leads went nowhere. Rosenberg, perhaps. But why hadn't he appeared sooner? And did he appear at all on that last evening? In 1995, an event occurred that added new mysteries. In Paris, in an antique shop in Montmartre, a suitcase with Regina Zbarskaya's belongings was discovered. How did it get there? The shop owner had bought it at an auction of unclaimed items. Inside were dresses, photographs, letters, and a diary. A small, leather-bound notebook filled with her handwriting. The last entry was dated November 10, 1987, 5 days before her death. He came. After all these years, he returned. Older, with gray at his temples, but it was him. My O. He suggests we run away. He has new documents for me. Tickets to Argentina. Argentina. So far from this hell. But can I? Will I have the strength? And most importantly, can I believe that this isn't another hallucination, not a cruel game by my tormented mind? Tomorrow he will come for an answer. What will I tell him? But in the official case file, there is no diary. The French police handed it over to the Russian embassy. From there, it was supposed to go to the investigators. But it didn't. It disappeared, like so much else in this story. Let's stop and think for a minute. Just imagine. You are a model at the fashion house on Kuznetsky Most, 1972. Your colleague, the very same Regina Zbarskaya, who just recently was an icon, a star of the first magnitude, now sits in the dressing room with shaking hands. You see how they humiliate her, how they mock her. What do? Stand up for her? Support her? Or stay silent? Galina Milovskaya chose silence. And 40 years later, that silence was tearing her apart from the inside. In 2012, already an 80-year-old woman, she agreed to an interview. Not just an interview, a confession. 3 hours of recording. Tears. Long pauses when she couldn't speak from shame. Do you know what the most terrifying thing about the system is? It makes everyone a participant. Absolutely everyone. We all knew what was happening to Regina. We saw how they were persecuting her, driving her insane. And we were silent. Why? Fear. Yes, of course. But not only that. There was also envy. Yes, don't be surprised. Envy for the one being destroyed. Because even broken, even at the bottom, Regina remained someone we could never be. She had been places where we were forbidden. Paris, Rome, London. Pierre Cardin kissed her hand. Fellini wanted to cast her in his films. And us? We were extras in her tragedy. I remember one moment. 73. Regina was almost never allowed on the catwalk anymore. She was sitting in the dressing room, watching us prepare for a show, and suddenly she said, "Galia, cherish your mediocrity. It's the only thing that will protect you from them." I was offended then. I thought, how arrogant. Even now, at the bottom, she humiliates us. Only later did I understand. She was trying to warn me, warning me to never, do you hear? Never try to become more than I was allowed. And here is testimony that gives a completely different perspective on this story. Elena Metiolkina, the one who confessed to Regina about spying on her, told her daughter the truth many years later. The daughter recorded this story on a dictaphone 1 month before her mother's death. Mom suffered from guilt her whole life. She said she had betrayed her only true friend. But do you know what else she said? That Regina knew about her denunciations from the very beginning. She knew, and she continued to be friends with her, to trust her with secrets. Mom asked her about it that evening when she confessed. Regina replied, "Lena, dear, do you think I have a choice in friends? At least you suffer from your conscience. The others sell me out with pleasure." But the most horrifying thing Mom told me was about one incident. 76. They sent a young model, Svetlana, after Regina. Beautiful, ambitious, ready to do anything for her career. Her task was to seduce the man Regina was in love with at the time, some Italian journalist who had come to do a report on Soviet fashion. Svetlana tried hard, flirted, batted her eyelashes, and suddenly Regina approached her and said, "Dear, you are beautiful, and you will surely get what you want. But remember, afterward, they will force you to write a detailed report. What he said in bed, what moles he has on his body, what he sighed about in his sleep. And 12 men at Lubyanka will read this report, and discuss it, and laugh. Are you ready for that?" Svetlana turned pale and left. A week later, she was transferred to the Leningrad fashion house. Regina saved her from the filth, from the shame, at the cost of her own, yet again, loneliness. But there were also those who are not silent, even now. In 2018, Tatiana Gordieva passed away, the director of the fashion house who actively participated in Regina's persecution. On her deathbed, she called for a priest, not for confession, for justification. The priest, Father Mikhail, later recounted the conversation. With the dying woman's permission, she wanted this to be heard. She said she had no choice, that if she hadn't agreed to destroy Zbarskaya, they would have destroyed her, and not just her. Her husband, her daughter, her grandchildren. "I chose my family," she repeated. Any mother would choose her family. But in her eyes, I saw not certainty, but pleading. She was begging me to agree, to confirm that she had done the right thing. I remained silent. Then she said a terrible thing. "You know, Father, sometimes I think, maybe Regina was happier than all of us. At least she died free. We have lived all these years in fear that one day they would come for us too." A photograph exists, taken in 1961 in Paris. Regina Zbarskaya stands on the balcony of the Hotel Plaza Athénée. Below is evening Paris, the lights of the Eiffel Tower. She isn't posing. She is simply looking into the distance. The photographer captured a moment of absolute happiness. Looking at this photo now, it is hard to believe that this woman would end her days in a communal apartment, forgotten by everyone. But let's try to understand who Regina Zbarskaya was for her era. Just a beautiful woman? A victim of the system? Or something more? The French philosopher and writer Bernard-Henri Lévy, who met Regina in the 60s, wrote these striking lines about her. She was a living refutation of the Soviet system. Her very existence proved that beauty does not submit to ideology. The Kremlin thought it was using her as a weapon, but beauty cannot be a weapon. It can only be itself. And that was Regina's tragedy. She was too authentic for a false world. And here is what Pierre Cardin wrote in his memoirs. When I first saw Regina, I understood that before me was not just a model. This was a woman enigma, a woman of contradiction. In her, the unjoinable was joined. Soviet reserve and Parisian chic, Slavic melancholy and Italian passion, childish naivety and ancient wisdom. She was like those Russian matryoshka dolls. You open one, and inside there is another, and so on infinitely. But the most poignant testimony was left by a man no one expected to hear from. In 2001, in Buenos Aires, an elderly man known to his neighbors as Don Oleg passed away. Before his death, he gave his lawyer a sealed envelope with a request to send it to Russia, to the editorial office of Moskovsky Komsomolets. Inside the envelope was a letter. I am writing this letter knowing I do not have long left. My real name will mean nothing to you. In Russia, I have been considered dead since 1983. But I must tell the truth about the last days of Regina Zbarskaya. Yes, I was there. I came for her, as I promised many years ago. We met in Paris in 1962. I was working. It doesn't matter what my job was. What matters is that I fell in love with her at first sight, and she saw in me not a Soviet intelligence agent, not a man of the system. She saw simply a man who was ready to do anything for her. When I was recalled from Paris, I understood they had separated us intentionally. Regina was becoming uncontrollable, and a Regina in love, even more so. They offered me a choice, forget her or disappear. I chose a third option. I faked my own death and went deep underground. 15 years I prepared her escape. I created new identities, found secure channels, saved money. And then, in November of '87, I returned. I found her in that horrible communal apartment. God, what had they done to her? But you know what? When she saw me, that same fire sparked in her eyes. She recognized me. After all those years, after all the experiments and drugs, she knew me. I offered her escape. Everything was ready. Documents in the name of Maria Rodriguez, tickets to Argentina via Vienna, money, a safe house in Buenos Aires. She agreed. She said she would come in 3 days. She just needed to say goodbye to her sister. But she didn't come. I waited at the arranged place for 6 hours. Then I went to her. A neighbor said Regina had locked herself in her room and wasn't letting anyone in. I begged her to open the door. She answered through the door. Leave, Oleg. Leave and live for both of us. I am too tired. And besides, they will never let me go. Even if I leave, they will find me. And I can't run anymore. Forgive me. Those were the last words I heard from her. 2 days later, I learned of her death. No, I do not believe in suicide. I think she knew they would come for her as soon as they learned of my visit, and she chose to leave on her own terms. Like a queen. I left for Argentina alone. I have lived here for 14 years, thinking of her every day. Do you know what she told me during our last meeting? Oleg, we won. They think they broke me, but they are wrong. I loved. I was loved. I lived a real life. But they were always dead. They just didn't know it. Forgive me, Regina. Forgive me for not being able to save you, but I fulfilled your request. I lived for both of us, and every day of that life was dedicated to you. The letter caused a shock. The KGB, the FSB, everyone denied the existence of such a person. But facts are stubborn things. Traces were found in the archives, fragmentary, erased, but traces. Operation Return, dated November '87. Search for an especially dangerous deserter. Order to liquidate if found. And so we have reached the end of this story. Or perhaps, the beginning. Because every time it seems all the I's have been dotted, a new detail, new testimony, a new document appears that turns everything upside down. Let's be honest. We will probably never know the full truth about Regina Zbarskaya. Too many documents have been destroyed. Too many witnesses have taken their secrets to the grave. Too many lies have been layered upon the truth over these decades. The story you have just heard was gathered piece by piece from dozens of sources. Recollections of contemporaries, declassified documents, interviews, diaries, and accidentally preserved photographs. Some facts are confirmed by documents. Yes, Regina Zbarskaya was indeed the first Soviet model to conquer the world's catwalks. Yes, she worked at the fashion house on Kuznetsky Most. Yes, her career was cut short under mysterious circumstances. Yes, she died on November 15, 1987 at the age of 52. But much remains in the realm of speculation and testimony that is impossible to verify. Was she recruited by the KGB? Was she used as a honey trap for foreign diplomats? Were psychopharmacological experiments conducted on her? Did the mysterious Oleg Rosenberg, who faked his own death for love, exist? Everyone is free to draw their own conclusions. What we know for certain is that Regina Zbarskaya became a symbol of beauty that doesn't fit within the lines, a symbol of talent that the system tries to press into its service, a symbol of a person crushed by the millstones of history, but who preserved her dignity to the end. The famous Russian culturologist Vitaly Tretyakov once said, "The Zbarskaya story is not a detective mystery or a melodrama. It is an ancient Greek tragedy, played out against the backdrop of the Soviet era. The heroine, endowed with the divine gift of beauty, challenges fate and perishes, but her demise is not a defeat. It is an apotheosis. She died as she lived, beautifully." And now, let's recall the words of Regina Zbarskaya herself, which she said in one of her last interviews, given in 1970 to the French magazine Elle. "Beauty is not something you possess. It is something that possesses you. You can try to sell it, exchange it for fame, money, love, but in the end, it will demand the ultimate price, your life. And you know what? I am willing to pay. Because to live unbeautifully is not to live at all." Perhaps the solution lies in these words. Regina Zbarskaya was not a victim. She was a warrior, fighting for the right to be herself in a world where individuality was considered a crime. Did she lose, or did she win? That is for you to decide. A legend exists. They say that in the fashion house on Kuznetsky Most, which no longer exists in its former state, footsteps are sometimes heard at night. Light, elegant, as if someone in high-heeled shoes is walking the catwalk. Security guards swear they have several times seen the silhouette of a woman in an evening gown. She appears for a moment and vanishes, leaving behind the faint scent of French perfume. A fabrication? Mass hallucination? Or perhaps it is the soul of Regina Zbarskaya, still coming out for her eternal show, demonstrating to the world what no one could take from her: beauty, grace, dignity. We will never know the whole truth. But perhaps we don't need to, because Regina Zbarskaya long ago ceased to be just a woman of flesh and blood. She became a myth, a legend, a warning, and an inspiration, all at once. Dear friends, thank you for walking this difficult path with us. Thank you for listening to this story to the end. We understand that it raises many questions, many emotions, perhaps arguments and disagreements, and that is normal. It means that Regina Zbarskaya's story is still alive, still important, still makes us think about the price of beauty, freedom, and love. We tried to be as objective as possible, to rely on available sources, to compare facts. But we also understand that in a story where personal tragedy and the state machine, love and betrayal, art and politics are intertwined, it is impossible to dot all the I's, nor is it necessary. What do you think about the fate of Regina Zbarskaya? Was she a victim of the system, or did she choose her own path? Is what the eyewitnesses say true, or has time distorted their memories? Did the mysterious Oleg, ready to do anything for love, exist? And most importantly, could this story have ended differently? Write your opinion in the comments. Share this video with friends. Let them also learn about the woman who became a symbol of an entire era. Leave a like if this story touched you, made you think, did not leave you indifferent. And remember, beauty is a force capable of changing the world, but it is also a responsibility. the responsibility to be oneself in a world that is constantly trying to make you into someone else. The story of Regina Zbarskaya is not just the story of one woman. It is a story about all of us, about our dreams and fears, about the price we are willing to pay for what is right, about the choice between safety and freedom. Her life ended 37 years ago, but the questions she left behind are still relevant today. What is more important, success or dignity? Safety or freedom? A long, mediocre life or a short, brilliant one? Everyone will have their own answer, and in this, perhaps, lies the main lesson of Regina Zbarskaya. She does not give ready answers. She forces us to seek them ourselves. Thank you for your attention. Until next time. And remember, beauty will save the world, if the world allows itself to be saved. That's